Okay, and we are back. Episode 15. This might even be the close of the season. I want to give a big shout out to our guests still in the house. We got Maggie Ledbetter. She is the owner and operator of the official Underground Arthouse of Chicago. Oh, unofficial. Yeah. It is. I tell you guys, if anyone watches this, you're in the Chicago area, if you get a chance to go to one of her events, like, oh my God, just don't miss it. If I could just jazz you up a little bit. The story I just told is, people remember, obviously, our guy Nils, Pat, who's on the Pat Cam doing some live painting for us. That's where we met Pat. And, you had this awesome art battle party a couple months ago. And I was there with a good buddy of mine, and I didn't realize I had a +1 ticket. And so we, I
put you on the VIP list.
You did? Oh my God, that girl.
I was like,
long story short, I call Nils. He just got out of like a birthday dinner and was like having a good time. I said, Nils, come to this party. If you don't, you're stupid. And he came through, and I think he said,
I'm going to tell you once.
Yeah. I think he said it was the coolest thing he did all year.
Oh, thank you. I mean,
and of course, shout out to Nils.
I get too much credit, honestly, for the place, because I believe that it's about the community. Literally, it's just the fact that you met Pat. Right. It's about bringing people together.
Met Pat, our other guest, Zeus and Ink, who did a phenomenal tarot reading for me.
Yeah.
All three of them were friends I'd met through the Underground Arthouse.
And I met them at a party that Jason Winslade threw, Ritual Rhythms, where they had their
to go
stuff
to a Ritual
out.
Rhythms.
Yeah. And I bought a beautiful wrapped guitar from them, and I told them, like in the fashion of the Underground Arthouse, I paid them full price for it, and I said, this is for the person that loves it, the one who falls in love with it. And they're like, oh, I wish I don't have $60 or $80 or whatever. And I was like, give it to that person.
I don't know if you know this, but the first party I had gone to was 2 years ago. It was whatever event you did after the art battle 2 years ago, and I actually left with one of the pieces. There was if you remember, it was a piece, it was like blue and white, and it had like spackle to make clouds on it. And then there was like a house and like an image of like a being. Do you recall the piece?
I don't. Well, you'd have to tell me actually when the date was. Was it a party in May or December?
No.
Was it a party in May?
It was, it had like a wheel on it, right? It had a wheel, and there was like some sort of like Roman god or something?
No. It was like, it had almost like a church steeple on the top. It was like a blue background, like it was in like the sky. And then there was like an empty, almost like a dollhouse on the bottom. The main thing was the spackle. It really doesn't even matter.
Okay.
But you had given it to a woman there named Jessica, who you knew, who was like an energy healer. And then I was talking about it with her.
Love this.
And I told her about the school of metaphysics. And I said, oh, that kind of reminds me of how we interpret dreams. And she was like, well, then you should have it. And to this day, it still hangs up at the Palatine branch.
That's fantastic. I love that, because one of the things that I'm trying to do, and perhaps the Underground Arthouse, is connect the person with the detritus. I say that the idea is that you want to put the art object, with the person who wants it, because art is subjective. And in fact, that is literally my favorite thing about art, and I'm consistent, is that it's subjective. That's the beauty of it.
I have some of my detritus on the detritus wall, as I think Nils maybe brought a piece, or I don't remember if he brought. Nils brought something. My good friend Sam, who you might have remembered, met, blonde hair, super good hair, and cool guy. And we all put up pieces together.
But the thing is that so detritus is sort of an old school New York art word for the art object. They say that which you could pick up and carry, or would say from a fire. So it's this very sort of physical thing. And the idea is about each person has a different relationship with each physical object. To nature, they're all the same. Detritus, that's the point. The paper thing that you put on the wall, your hair, your bones when you die, everything. Like the Van Gogh, all the broken things, your grandmother's ring. So what makes something art? What makes something precious? It's literally how you feel about it.
I totally agree. I think I've spoken on the show. I had an ex-girlfriend, and she like taught me how to appreciate art, and I'm forever grateful to that. But getting down to it, and I love how much we talk about art on the show, because it's a very, like you said, it's how you connect. It's a very spiritual experience. Yet today, I think our topic was going to be the the intersection of philosophy and spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what drew you to want to talk about that today?
Because of all things that I am, like you say when you're introducing me, I am an atheist philosopher above all else. The rebranding of that now is natural philosopher, by
I
which
kind of like
I
that
mean,
better.
yeah, right. I'm sure. But and that's fine. That's good then. That's good. So it is more natural philosophy actually, and the rebranding, is real. And in all natural philosophy, basically, one quote that I like, I think it's Voltaire, is it asks us to calculate, to weigh, to measure, to observe. The rest is mostly chimera. So it's like you be observational, non-judgmental, to pay attention. Basically, this is your work, and the fallout is that it makes you basically all the things, kind, ultimately, reasonable, kind, sort of wise at least, and just happier. Mm-hmm. Because it begins with curiosity and also being interested in other people, right? If you're observational, or if maybe the curiosity comes first, I'm not sure, but it's to withhold judgment and just pay attention turns out to be quite fun.
See, my main reason why I kind of like the rebranding from atheist philosophy to natural is because, and not to say that like some people don't do this, but when you look at it as just like atheist, it just makes this big deal about
Totally.
if God is a thing or not.
Totally.
And if that's your philosophy and that's what you want to philosophize about, that's fine. But that
Definitely not.
But that doesn't capture the essence of what you're actually talking about, which is just the observable universe, my observable self, and all the things that you said. That's truly what you're morally talking about. You're not kind of, well, hopefully you're getting less into the whole, is God a thing or not?
Definitely, exactly. So, Frank Lloyd Wright said, "I believe in God, only I call it nature." Which, I mean, exactly. And in fact, so in all sort of natural philosophy, I would say truth is the highest ideal. Ultimately, virtue is its own reward, but truth is the highest ideal. And reason is a direct corollary of truth. So it's like, thou shalt be reasonable, right? And then it just sort of works itself out from there. Like I was saying, the kind of fallout from it.
It reminds me of what is traditionally seen as a spiritual philosophy, but it's an Indian philosophy, very commonly called Buddhism.
Exactly. Uh-huh.
And because I always, when I talk to spiritual people, because I meet a lot of people, and I'm a believer in the Lord or whatever you want to call it, and people I talk to, or if they come to me at the School of Metaphysics, we can't discuss about God. They're like, do I have to believe in God to be like a spiritual person? And I say, no, absolutely not, because the Buddha proved that. He would not answer the topic of if there was a God or not.
Because it wasn't relevant, exactly. And natural philosophy, too. I've been criticized for saying it again. He's one of the early atheist philosophers. I've gotten into trouble for saying that. But exactly, it's about what I mean by that. And it's like, well, he talked about philosophy in a way that did not sort of talk about something that sort of judged you in the afterlife. Or it was like, it didn't refer to a certain thing. You see what I'm saying? That's present in a lot of, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but present in a lot of modern religions, right? It was like a, life is suffering, right? Which I always say, like a modern Buddha, which I get in trouble for again, would say toughen up in a way. Like he'd listen to the whole story, everything. And then it would be like life is suffering, exactly. And then now what? And also our modern suffering is nothing compared to people in their times, like with dysentery and childbirth and eyesight and everything. Because the other stuff, it is about humanity. But then how do we help that? Because just because life is suffering doesn't mean I'm dismissing it. It's to say, And suffering is in large part born of selfish desire. And then it's like that helps with things like entitlement, natural fallout, right? So it's true though too. It's like, yeah, why do you want this or that? It's like, keep thinking, keep breaking it down. That's your selfish desire. That person is drawing their own thread. You don't want to interfere with that, right? And if you do, why? And then again, it all traces back to the beginning. It's like, well, and do unto others and all those things, and thou shalt be reasonable. And if you're following a certain path, again, and because the consequences come back, hence karma, known in mathematics as the law of averages, is also kind of the law of attraction. It is kind of all the same thing, right? You could break it down in a reasonable way, but without discrediting it, right?
Well, I mean, even on top of that, whether or not there is some metaphysical reality or not, you could say that subjectively, most cultures eventually arrive at some idea like karma. And it's just because of, for better or worse, it's just something that seems to be innate to the human psyche that we believe for reasons that are either maybe, flawed rationalizations or some intuitive perception of, the world beyond that, good leads to good, bad leads to bad. In a way, you could even say that the Buddhist philosophy is a philosophy of perception, and that the Buddha honed and mastered and then introduced new techniques of how to perceive at a higher level. You eventually, the term being like enlightenment in English is that there is supposedly, if you live your life in a specific way and it's a very different way, you ultimately perceive the world like fundamentally differently. And what most people...
And is it a truer version of the world than other people see?
Well, it's interesting.
Or no?
The Buddha would say, and a lot of spiritual people would say, in a spiritual philosophy, that yes, it is a truer version. What you see when you study like various saints and sages, people who've been enlightened or like holy people, is that when they reach this altering of perception, they have this uncanny direct experience that this is actually the way the world is. And that other things that have been seen are misperceptions of the world, where your ego, if you want to go back to natural perception, that your human psyche has constructed on relatively just repeatable and universal ways based on, human psychology, human biology,
right,
that perceives the world in this way, and it has inherent limitations. But that's usually what they say is that it's just, they report that they have this uncanny, unshakable, direct experience of this, yes, what they saw beforehand was not real, and what they saw after was real. However, a spiritual teacher and author I love dearly, David Hawkins, they call him Doc, he, I believe, reached this altered state of perception. And he made a lot of research and writings about the nature of human consciousness.
Like an enlightened person, you mean?
Yeah. And what he said is it's like, okay, yeah, at higher levels of consciousness, you are seeing the truth of the world. But that doesn't mean that a lower level is not true. It is true at its own level,
Totally.
When you say it's not real,
who's you?
Oh, when any person were to say like, okay, say like a spiritual
you, the
person.
general person.
Well, let's say like a spiritual
person who self-identifies as spiritual.
Exactly.
That's important to me, and I also believe 100%. And I'm consistent that in natural philosophy, semantics is an ever-present, consistent, absolutely critical theme.
Oh, well, don't be afraid to get into it with me then.
No, well, of course. I mean, honestly, in my philosophy, Matheism, I call it, there's just two tenets. The two tenets are, when in doubt, be magnanimous, and doubt is the origin of wisdom. So you err on the side of doubt, you err on the side of magnanimity, right? So it's thou shalt not be certain. And in Bayesian analysis, right, there are no zeros and ones because you always have to recalculate when you get new information. So if you ever put in a 0, like you're 100% certain that's not the case, you could never recalculate because 0 times anything is 0. So you leave that one kernel of sand of doubt so that you can keep taking information without prejudgment.
Yeah.
But and then erring on the side of magnanimity, which is mostly about a generosity of spirit, right? That's largely about forgiveness, actually, and mercy, but gratitude, kindness, grace, essentially. If you lean into this side, it's like, when in doubt, be magnanimous. And then number 2, doubt is the origin of wisdom. So again, it's like, and then how do you deal with that? Only 2 obsessions, as I would say, semantics and projection. And what I mean by that is, like, at no point should you forget that first of all, you're projecting. Okay, if you in people's knee-jerk
people don't
reaction,
understand how much of human psychology is just projection.
I mean, yes, exactly. And then, like, tell me this isn't a problem. So this is like the elephant in the room, but then you tell
Don't call
someone
Pat
they're
an elephant.
projecting. What's that?
Don't call Pat an elephant.
You're projecting.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted. I just needed to make a dumb joke.
I get it. The elephant in the room. In a way, that's true. We haven't acknowledged Pat, who's painting over here. My good
Pat.
friend Pat Kinnear. Oh yeah, you did, Gino. You did.
Well, if I could just cut in on the topic of both semantics and projection,
Yes.
To what I was saying earlier, was okay. So what a person who would identify with a spiritual philosophy, an idea that is often present, and it comes from various Eastern faiths and traditions, is that there is an unreality to the world that you perceive. You could say that this world is unreal, or it's commonly referred to as an illusion. And
The brain in the vat idea, an old idea in philosophy that's like that we could be a brain in a vat. How do you know?
something like
That's
that.
about that, like, kernel of sand. It's sort of an old question echoing in philosophy that's good. That's like, how do you even know that you're here?
Oh, they go so deeper on that. They go to the point of, like, your perception of an individual self is in fact an illusion. And what a lot of people will find solace in that, because that helps them to disconnect, recontextualize, heal a lot of the suffering they've been through or in the world. At the same time, and then they project that onto the world and to others. And whether that's true or not, well, you'd have to become a yogi or a rigorous Buddhist or a very devout spiritual person to find out if that's true.
And they project past experiences onto present and future experiences.
Well, I mean, that's what we all do at some level.
Exactly. Well, the enemy of pattern recognition is false pattern recognition, and that's a huge problem. So people, again, bring their prejudices to the table.
Well, a problem that sometimes this particular idea in spiritualist philosophies comes up is that, okay, you try to tell people, like, oh, you sometimes good-naturedly try to invalidate people. You're trying to help them often, but you say, like, oh, that terrible thing that happened to you, don't be so caught up about it because it's not real. And one of the ways that...
What do you mean by real? Because they wouldn't use that language in conversation? You're saying
Oh,
that they
some people in my
dismiss it
community
as-
would. They said that's not a
when
real
you-
thing anyway. It's an illusion.
What, the trauma that happened to you?
Yeah. Some people take it a little too far. And it makes...
The part about being an illusion? In other words, you're saying that
No,
they're
like the
gaslighting you per se?
your lived experience is illusory, so don't get too caught up on it.
When they say illusory, do they mean that didn't happen in historical reality?
Not that, but that it's difficult to... Well, no, let me try to explain. What they're trying to say is that the amount of meaning and intellectual and emotional weight that you created, which was totally understandable because you're just a human being who, like, your mom died or someone was very bad to you, or to say the least, or you made a grave error that had consequences, is that the framework that your mind assigned all these values to it is fundamentally incorrect, and that you really should just be more detached about it. It's not as big of a deal.
Well, and what you're talking about too, going back again, because there's an obsession there. Issue of semantics is what people often label as trauma, right? What you're describing, to sort of to take that baggage that happened. Now it's kind of a modern word to describe what could be, and also other people, overusing it to describe something that's like, well, now you're sort of messing up that word, right? And even the way it used to be applied, like earlier, even to soldiers, that's like trying to conceptualize this idea of like PTSD I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're saying is that some people, when somebody who's describing trauma that's real, that's the whole point, is like all these things that happen to them that were unfair, that have never been acknowledged, right? That were abusive, that nobody has ever confessed for or apologized to. There's been no justice, and nobody's even willing to label it trauma. That's kind of what they mean by unreal. And it's like trauma is just a thing. But very importantly, then, to flip it, back to my philosophy, is that what the point is, what happened in historical reality. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's trauma. It isn't. We could sit here all day and talk about it, but I don't want to. That's for a sidebar. Right?
Yeah.
The point is what happened in historical reality, who's accountable for it, how can we heal from that, and what should we let go of, right?
So in a largely spiritual philosophy, what they would say is that it's unreal in that there is a supposed, or something that you could confirm if you reached a higher state of consciousness, like we were saying, there's this actual thing that's going on. And it's very different than your lived experience. Mm-hmm. And some people find that by connecting to that and that idea,
their own lived experience,
and they connect their lived experience to this belief or potentially reality that they were misperceiving the situation anyway. It helps them to release a lot of the baggage, which is for some people is very useful.
And they were misperceiving the situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, even if you go to
everyone is misunderstood on some level, and because we're all projecting, and there's a semantic gap, meaning we use words differently, and we take for granted that, like, that's the thing. People get off in the weeds so fast. That's why I said it's important. Yeah. And the closest thing I know to enlightenment, I've said this before, and I'm consistent, is what I, again, quotes, understanding semantics. It's literally the closest thing I know to enlightenment. Sometimes I feel like I'm sort of like a little bit floating above a room and thinking, I wish I could explain to these people some of what's happening analytically, and how they agree with each other more or less in certain ways, and it shouldn't be. And the point is now they're talking in a way quite quickly that's descended from all confusion, essentially, and people don't realize how much is happening. And one of the ways to do that, again, erring on the side of doubt, if you will, is to let people define words for themselves, right? And then listen, close listening. You plug that concept in, and don't try to tell people how to use words. Don't hit the red button. We're like, that's not the dictionary definition.
Yeah.
And it's like, let me follow you around. Yeah, let me follow you around and hit the red button every time you don't use
don't
it.
Eat protein. Don't think for yourself. The word green means red here.
Well, here's one thing I do like about a lot of spiritual philosophies, at least how I look. As long as it's not a philosophy, which are valid, or if you like them, about the existence of some other side, is that I often find a lot of what is commonly a spiritual philosophy usually can stand on its own merits. So even with this idea of the unreality of your perceptions, I think you could understand this without having any belief in like hoodoo or something beyond the material physical world. Is that, okay, say something traumatic happened to me and it was coded into my biology because I had an extreme stress reaction. Physiologically, it coded my nervous system. And when I experienced it, I was in the consciousness of trauma, sadness, anger, despair. I perceive it like that, and I live that. You could say at one level, there's an unreality to it, even in the physical world. Because if that same person were to, either in the situation or more likely later on, step back and now view the same experience through the consciousness of, like you said, an analytical mind, they would experience it a bit differently. And that is often recommended.
But in a way, why is sort of that relevant? What's relevant is sort of what happened in historical reality. And I think one of the things too, where if you will, the semantic gap between us is I don't really understand the way that you're using unreality. And I think that literally the first divide in philosophy, essentially, is between the people who think there is such thing as the truth and the people who think that it's all a matter of perception. So
Well,
is
it's
the glass
perception,
half
is the
empty or
unreality
half
of it.
full? Well, this is what I'm saying is this is my version of it,
Yeah.
right? Is the glass half empty or half full? But I would say it's about how many milliliters of liquid are in what container. Or as my brother would say, it's refillable.
Yeah. So the relevance of like, why would that unreality or that recontextualizing of a thing, what would be, I would even disagree that there's some level of what is a relevance beyond the historical accounting of what happened is people trying to heal from these things,
yeah.
to recontextualize it. Because if you get really caught in the historical reality of this was an extremely shitty thing that happened to me and it defined me and it hurt me and it programmed me.
It's like wherefore that happened. You don't focus on it, right?
Well,
What I'm
people
saying is
do.
it's important what happened. Yeah. But what I'm saying is like it's important to again. It's really just about recognition, at some level of recognition. What might happen on ayahuasca or something.
Yeah.
To just let down the floodgate and like, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened, and all this trauma, and that people should have been accountable, or that this didn't happen, but then once dealt with. That's the whole point. Is
And there's
now, but yes, it's very much focused on.
And there's definitely, I shouldn't misrepresent
right?
spiritual philosophies, that there is a lot of allotment for that. There, I was just discussing one idea,
about
but
moving
essentially
on from it.
what a lot of times people in certain spiritual philosophies try to do is they try to find ways to recontextualize what they perceived so that they can exist in a better subjective state.
Totally.
You know, if you can, and that's why something you were touching on earlier is another important thing in a spiritual philosophy is like virtues. Because when you live virtues, try to understand virtues, perceive the world through various virtuous means, it often makes a lighter experience of the mind and self.
And yes, and you have to decide what the virtues are for yourself. Confucius said that kindness, courage, and wisdom are sort of the three
I love
universal.
Confucius.
Yes, the three universal virtues, basically, of man. But you get to decide for yourself. So I personally would say for sure reason. Reason is a virtue, and other things as well. Gratitude is a virtue. But what are your sort of high ideals?
For me, a very big one
Because
is love.
one could be faith for somebody.
Oh, yeah.
But for me, that isn't one. So again, about deciding what your virtues are.
Yeah. And I would say if there was like a benefit to certain spiritual philosophies, and that this stands, it's where this intersection between more of a material philosophy and a spiritual philosophy is that the value of various virtues really does not need to depend on if following a virtue will lead me to heaven or hell. Living a life with love makes a life better, whether or not you believe Jesus was the one true savior of mankind, or you just happen to be amenable to love. Wisdom is, it makes a more in-depth and successful life, whether or not you believe that, Solomon was a wise dude or not. He had some things that were good to say.
Yeah, no, the baby thing was good.
The baby story. Yeah, that was
the funny thing. The other day, my daughter and I were saying that we were sort of going to race each other upstairs to like use the hot water, right? And she was like, "Well, if I can't have the hot water, you can't." And she was like, "Says we could split the baby. We'll split the baby."
Yeah. Whoever cares more gets the hot water.
Right?
Yeah.
I just thought it was funny, but it's like I didn't know she knew that because she's 12, but I was glad that she did.
An educated young lady.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that I think is, and of course I would not say that spiritual philosophies, religious philosophies own virtues. To me, that would be an arrogant statement. I think one nice thing about numerous spiritual philosophies is that they do often put a heavy emphasis on them. And of course, that's not to say that more straight up material philosophies, natural philosophies do not. For me, one thing that I was introduced in my philosophies is that a virtue is something that you live, or it's something you become. At the school I'm in, School of Metaphysics. We believe in universal laws. It's part of our philosophy. That laws that run the metaphysical and physical universe. And a law we talk about is that there's this thing called believing and knowing. And essentially that when you start by believing in something, you come to know it. But it has to start with the belief. And I applied that in my own life because I remember when I was just a wee lad getting into spiritual stuff, I decided I wanted to know like about love. I was raised Catholic. Universal love's important.
Yeah, and that's very important to me to learn that, of course, that you were raised Catholic. As somebody who's always to calculate, to weigh, to measure, to observe. I'm always taking information. My mind is like, because I'm very interested in other people. That is very relevant to my understanding of you.
Yeah. Funny enough, my last name in Italian actually translates roughly to belief in God. Credi being belief, Dio being God. But anyway, so I decided I wanted to know this virtue. I believed in this virtue. And I believed that, Jesus and figures like him wanted me to be unconditional loving that there was probably a reason for it beyond just like, oh, that's how you get into heaven. And so I set out to try to understand the virtue and try to live it. And what I discovered was that when so a teaching people are probably familiar with in Christian philosophy is that Jesus said, love thy enemy as thyself and pray for those who persecute you.
I was just going to say he was a great moral philosopher.
Yeah.
Turn the other cheek, do unto others. Right. Even in the Bible, he himself Jesus of Nazareth, right, said all the best stuff, I think. Right.
And I love those specific teachings because when you really think about them, they're kind of batshit. Who the fuck would do something as stupid as to love their enemies? Like, why the fuck should I do that? And I wanted to figure out why. So I'll go into that story some other time. But what I ended up finding by just trying to live that virtue and become that virtue was that there was a reason for it.
Exactly.
And the reason, whether or not I go to heaven or not, we'll find out. Or to eternal darkness. And then you never be able to hold it over my head because we'll both be annihilated and no one can bug me. But if I'm right, I can hold it over you forever.
It's because it's a solution. Do you know what I mean? It's a problem-solving device to love your enemy, if you will. If you plant seeds of kindness, of love, of joy, it'll come back to you. If you start a war, it'll come back to you.
Hey, look who read the news these days.
It's true, but if you kill generations of people's children, it will come back.
It's probably not going to go super well for you.
Yeah, no, but it's like over and over again. What I mean is it becomes this cycle. So if you love your enemy, what starts happening now? If you could do it truly, if you could actually, factually love your enemy, love would take over quite quickly.
Well, I totally agree with everything you said. And I did discover that in ways. People were nicer to me when I became more and more loving. Surprise, surprise.
Exactly.
They put up with my bullshit more.
Exactly. You tolerate you well.
But what I found was even more deep than that, was that when I found that I became habitually just unconditionally loving no matter what, to the best of my ability, obviously, I'm not a fucking saint. What I discovered was that actually what happens is your direct subjective experience of love, because at one level, love's like something you feel. Mm-hmm. Over time, it grows.
For sure.
And you start to experience love more and more deeply. And what I believe strongly is like, wow, like of the many sensations you could experience as a human being, it's no surprise that love is one of the best. And that was, and what he said actually is like, what reward should you have by just loving those who are good to you? He said even the tax collectors did that. And what I discovered was, oh my God, the reward is that just by trying this, I personally experience love more frequently and deeper.
Totally. It's a natural fallout. Again, like
that was what I observed.
Yes, one thing leads to another. Exactly. One practice leads to another. So again, I do believe truly that it starts with reason, essentially. Thou shalt be reasonable. And then if you're sort of and erring, it's like erring on that side. And also the doubt, doubt is the origin of wisdom has to do with the idea that you've never walked a mile in the other person's shoes, always, right? Like their relationship with their mother, their father, language, neighborhood, like travel, sex, education, right? All the things all the time. Like they're so radically different from yours. And again, you're projecting all the time, and there's this gap that people don't understand each other, right? And we're all just, beautiful humans that are connected, all completely, and with the mushrooms and everything else, the mycelia,
like
right down to it.
Yeah.
The truth. The point is, as I'm saying, it's true. They merge quite quickly, I guess, is my point. Very quickly. Again, Jesus is a moral philosopher, even as an example, and the things along the way that's like, well, clearly this isn't right. We can all agree on this, because even it trickles down into humanism almost immediately. It's like, wherefore we're all specks of dust, right? Wherefore we're all equal under God. Now what? How do you be good? How do you be happy? What does it mean to be good, right? And then, meanwhile, right, you're being reasonable all the way, which leads very quickly to kindness, which immediately has its other, which leads quickly to wisdom, right? And this mergence, and then in the end, it allows you to love people just so much, to just love and be generous, even when you know people don't like you, right?
Yeah.
It's even, and kill them with kindness. I'm a proponent. It's also a strategy, not a personality.
It is, yeah.
It's a strategy, and it works. And that's the thing. But if you have grace, it's not that hard to kill it with kindness, because, you know, we're all misunderstood. It's like, I'll ingratiate myself. Just you watch. How? By loving, by not judging. I'm going to say, I just work here, you know, and I'm trying to observe.
The philosophy of the Underground Arthouse.
Sure. Exactly. It's a pun. And also that's a pun in that case, because that's about, we're all equally accountable, sort of for what we're doing, and equally entitled in the house. This idea of I just work here, as do you. And then immediately the question is, what are we doing? Right. And that's also the question in really natural philosophy 101 is, what are we doing here? And the point is, you get to decide. And again, it turns into humanism and what a lot of people label as spirituality, and as a mode too of getting rid of trauma, which I 100% support. 100%.
Well, you know, Maggie, one of the things that I discovered, at least in my own personal attempts to understand a lot of spiritual philosophies, is that most of the teachings that became like a dogma, became like, you got to do this to go to heaven, or you got to do this because Jesus said you to, and people misunderstand, you know, is that what I discovered is that for most of those things that like take faith, or there's like, just try it kind of a thing, is that there was a reason why. It was reasonable. It's difficult to explain the reason, but generally it's like, why be unconditionally loving? It raises your consciousness. You experience more love. Why forgive? It releases you from suffering and from the karmas of that, whether you believe in something
being
metaphysical or not. It frees you.
Right?
Be compassionate. It helps you to recontextualize your suffering. And then what I think, again, a lot of people who are more materialist natural philosophers, maybe they not misunderstand, not, you know, strangely harp on in religious philosophies, is that it's like there's this faith and there's dogma, and it's like, why do you do these things blindly? And I think a lot of even religious people don't understand it. But oftentimes, you know, the goal of spiritual philosophy is to raise your consciousness, and for many people, you would say to hit the paradigm shift that is in English called enlightenment. And the answer to why live the Eightfold Path, which is a Buddhist thing, why have complete faith in God, which is a Christian thing, why acclaim that Christ is your savior, or why acclaim that Muhammad was, you know, peace be upon him, was the last of the prophets, was that these principles, these ideas, which show up in different ways, if you live them rigorously, they raise your consciousness. That's the reason why. And of course, you know, the Semitic peoples and the Arab peoples, if you want to go with that, or like the Indian peoples who said these words, they didn't have this language. Also, they're talking, like you said, the suffering at that time. They're talking to people who had a whole other set of problems, and education wasn't as prevalent. So how are they going to explain that? even if they directly understand that, like, how was Moses going to tell that to the Israelites as you're just wandering through the desert, you know?
Essentially.
Well, to explain, like, hey, don't kill other people.
Right.
Don't.
The commandments,
Yeah.
sort of.
Don't
the dogma.
covet. Yeah, don't covet, because if you don't do that, and if you live righteously, your metaphysical subjective state of consciousness is going to rise, and eventually there will be a paradigm shift where you'll experience the direct nature of reality and oneness with God. You know, how was Moses going to say that in Hebrew like several thousand years ago? You know, to people just to largely, to peasants and largely warriors who were and former slaves who were just trying to get to Canaan. You know, he can't. Maybe like 10 people there. We're going to understand that, and frankly, that's another reason to me why in like Christian philosophy, you know, you've heard of parables, right? Parables.
Oh, yeah.
Teaching through stories, you know. And if you actually read the Bible, a lot of the parables, Jesus says straight up, like, I'm not going to explain this. Like, not even to the apostles, his direct followers.
Love that.
A couple he does explain. But he says, like, you have to have the ears to hear it.
Totally.
So
and interpret for yourself. I love that. It's almost like a jury. Again, the sort of humanism of it. It's like, I can't decide for you. I can preside over it, right? I can sort of wish you well. I can teach you the lessons that guide you. But immediately, again, it's true, people start projecting.
They do.
And then they have to simplify it to the commandments. I think George Carlin has this thing where he's like, the commandments could be, he boils them down to something, and I think they're like, number 1, thou shalt always be honest and faithful. I think number 2 is thou shalt not kill, and number 3 is thou shalt keep thy religion to thyself.
Oh yeah, Carlin's big on stuff like that.
Well, he was actually a famous atheist. He was. His stuff was quite philosophical, and essentially, I agree with what he said, which again is that it sort of descends quickly into why should we be good? Because if we're all just here, shouldn't we love our neighbor and do unto
and I think a lot of more like spiritual peoples or religious peoples will often misunderstand, well, if you don't believe in an afterlife or karma or stuff, why not just go killing and murdering and all this stuff? And it's like, actually there was a show, I forget, and it was God, what was the guy who did the British version of The Office?
Oh,
Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais.
Oh.
And he was posed that question in the show by a very religious woman in the show.
Nice.
And he said, well, I don't just, you know, if I watch a movie and I know it's going to end, I don't just go halfway through the movie like, oh, fuck it, like turn it off. You know, I still want to see the movie and I still want to be touched by the movie. You don't need a lot. Yeah, it's a very simple argument.
Penn Jillette said, I don't know how controversial this is, but he's also a famous atheist, Penn Jillette, the magician who works with Teller. And he said that someone asked him that same question, that he like bleeped all the women he wanted to, because he didn't want to do it to anyone, obviously. Because again, if we're all just here, it's like, why would I want to do that? If we're all just sort of like equal under God, and you know, what kind of a question is that even? Like, what does it matter if there's an afterlife? The way to be good is, and then exactly tell them what they're doing wrong. It also usually leads to vegetarianism. Because it's like, well, you know, again, why are we raping and murdering the animals? And are you killing them yourself? Because
you start learning about factory farms, and suddenly, you know, your desire to eat meat is just like, do I really need to do this?
True.
But, you know, sometimes you do it anyway.
Yeah, but you realize, like, as you do it less, and again, it does go to spirituality, because I do think there's a tie, and again, it's just a branding of something, right? That spirituality and philosophy have a huge overlap because they merge quickly. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think they really merge because, to me, spirituality is anything that has to do with my direct subjective experience of life, because that's my spirit. It's the part of me that is live, whether or not it's this metaphysical thing or it's just this body on, lights are on, doesn't really matter, because subjectively it's all the same. And so when you start investigating, you start becoming spiritual, and you want to know more about the
your
things
interior
that keep
life,
exactly,
sort of. Yeah,
you know, then you well, philosophy is, it also is that. It is the interior life of the mind at one level, and the two go hand in hand. you know?
Exactly. It's like, wherefore the natural world? What should one do with the interior life of the mind? It becomes very important. What is the soundtrack of your mind? You're controlling that, right? Your destiny will come to you through the soundtrack of your mind. So what should you be telling yourself, right?
And I think one of the things that is very prevalent in a lot of spiritual philosophies is that, because the spiritual philosophies, whether East or West, often have to do about your interior life, you start to look at and investigate what's going on. And then you find there's this big wealth of wisdom. And in the West, we have, like philosophers of the mind, such as like Descartes. That's the easy one. I don't know the others as well. But in what you find is a value in a lot of spiritual philosophies that come out of largely Indian cultures, is that they investigated the interior world and the mind and even the body extremely deeply. And they found, like Sadhguru says, they found a handbook for it. Mm-hmm. And so that is a huge benefit of, even if you don't believe in like hoodoo or something beyond the physical world, if you investigate, especially yogic philosophy or Buddhist philosophy, they start telling you very accurate statements about the nature of how you work. And you can really consume that and live that. And just like the Buddha said, you don't have to believe in God at all. In fact, the Buddha said your belief in God, a specific form of God, may actually be an obstacle to raising in consciousness to a level.
One of the things Descartes said that I love is, if you would be a real seeker after truth, you must at least once in your life doubt as far as possible all things. And I think that echoes, and to me, everything in a way, ironically, I guess, that you're saying, right?
So kind of a final topic of conversation before we start wrapping up that you reminded me of is there's this really incredible film project on, it's mostly on YouTube, called Inner World, Outer Worlds. It's super trippy. It's this modern interpretation of, like samsara, perceptual reality, East meets West, and just really well done. Mm-hmm. And one thing that the team, and I guess the gentleman who made it, talks about is he talks about how, to the Buddha, he talks about how in Buddhist philosophy, the reality starts in the perception that is beyond the thoughts. Like when you experience the world beyond the entrapment of thinking.
Right.
That's when you really start to that's becoming enlightened.
Right.
And what he said was, Descartes famously doubted, and then got all the way to, I think, therefore I am.
Exactly.
And what this gentleman said, he said, if only he, like, imagine what would have happened if he would have went one step further. Mm-hmm. Because if he would have kept investigating his psyche and his direct experience and transcended thought to perceive what the Buddha calls the Dhamma, the true reality.
Because you'd be going the other direction.
Well, you go even.
But Rene Descartes is actually saying at the beginning, I think wherefore I am is like, I don't think I'm a brain in a vat. I think, but wherefore my five senses are leading into this. It's like you have to take that first kernel of faith, right? So then he works the logic down is in this direction as far as now what. But I think spirituality in a way is working it in the other direction. Is what you're saying. How did we get here?
Yeah.
How did we get to the first step?
Well, many spiritual philosophers.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Which leads us to God.
Well, that's what they say is eventually what the spiritual philosophers say is that when you go the other direction and you investigate the self and you get more focus onto the context of your consciousness, instead of the content of your consciousness being your sensations, your perceptions, and your thoughts, when your perception switches in focus to that, what they call God is often that they report, is that when that dominates your direct perception, your subjective reality, it's cross-cultural. They describe that there is a perception or an absolute reality of a singular unified presence in consciousness that you are intimately one with. That is actually, as Alan Watts said, is the thing that is moving the sun and the moon and the stars. And that you directly are it. And that this fits all the categories of what you would call God other than being an individualized thing. And that's what they call, like, you know a way I could describe it for semantics?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was gonna say, people describe God in different ways, and on all these things that you're saying, it's usually abstract nouns that people start to misunderstand each other about, in general. Whether it's like racism or civilization, or God, obviously, is a big trigger. But
Yeah.
people start projecting onto the other people's use, and they're sort of take offense at other people's use in many ways, and want to correct it or want to try to agree on it. They want to agree on it.
We like that shit.
Even people, I mean, really, and I think it's silly. Catholics, I've seen several times Catholics fight about whether the other one essentially is Catholic because they do or don't do that.
Yeah.
This is a thing. And it's just, I think it's quite absurdist from my perspective. It's like, it is what it is. It do what it do. Who are you to decide about self-identification or gender or something else too? What a weird projection to want them to
who gives a
use
fuck?
your dichotomy of synonyms that are essentially arbitrary in a world where, we're all projecting and there's a semantic gap. Essentially, it's like, give it up, let people be themselves, and then too you can get more interior. If you're always fighting the world for truth and justice, it's very hard to find out who you are as a person on the inside.
Yeah, though to just give credit where credit's due, sometimes when you do that and you pursue that, you do better the world. But to come kind of full circle, to explain the semantics of what I meant by unreality, and this perception of like God and oneness.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of Ramana Maharishi?
No.
So he was a famous Indian saint, I think in the last 100 or so years, that was supposedly enlightened. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a book called, a very small pocket book called Who Am I? And it's a conversation where he's answering questions. And he explains what it's like when you're on the other side of the enlightenment threshold.
Interesting.
He said, when you find the self with a capital S, he describes it as the jewel within.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
And he says, once you find that, you see the world as it is. He says, you perceive that there is no individual self. There's never been an individual self. It goes backwards into your memory. He says, you see that you, what you thought you were, has never done anything. You see that all things only ever happened because of Shiva. That Shiva, being in Christian terms, you more liken him to God the Father, that Shiva is the only one who has ever done anything. All things happen, all actions and causes and effects occur because of Shiva manifesting them. And that is what's actually happening. And that you and Shiva, it's to say you are one isn't even true. It's like you are that. In a lot of Hindu scriptures, they say, thou art that. You are that. And that you perceive that directly. And he says Shiva, which then is described that essentially you could say that God is the only one ever doing anything. And that before you made that shift and you were in the realm of thought, it was unreal because really you were just commenting and you thought you were doing things, but really you were just commenting on the things that were already happened and you were obsessed with it. That's the spiritual philosophy of enlightenment, at least as I see it.
Yes. Well, I mean, I do think that makes perfect sense. But also, I mean, I shouldn't say, but describing it from maybe my perspective, my understanding, is it's like we're all drawing a thread basically through historical reality, right? This little, but we're consistent. I feel a consistency. There's a thread we follow. Yeah. And it's like we're all doing it right next to each other. It's
there's
like
a consistent thread of my subjective experience through reality.
Well, you're one thread. Do you see what I'm saying? See, I mean, I guess again, the point of having these conversations, and also with the sidebars, is almost to see about what you disagree. Right? It's like, I think what we disagree about, which is great, is sort of the definition of unreality.
Sure.
Not the definition, but like the way one conceptualizes. Yeah, is a better way to think of it. Again, abstract nouns. Talk about
if only we were telepathic.
Noun. What's unreality, right? But yeah, we wouldn't. It's like we're talking about this in a way the whole time. Because I think that in a way there is no unreality, because we're all drawing this line through the time-space continuum that's quite real. You know, your experience has been, even without ever knowing something, you know what I mean? You could probably describe a lot of it, right? And again, it's very different from my own. And all those things really happen, and we're all here together, and it's a miracle. And I truly do believe in a miracle as a natural or atheist philosopher. Literally, not even metaphorically, it is a miracle that we're here and existing, because mathematically it's essentially impossible. Any computer would tell you that it's impossible. It would be like if the same person won every lottery ever in Mesopotamia, you know, and New Jersey and whatever, you know, a raffle. Sure, throw it in. It's many orders of magnitude less probable than that you're here. And that's a miracle that I can't explain. And also conception is sort of itself very strange, you know, in its coolness, right? But so it's improbable beyond belief. But again, now what?
Well, now what is, Pat, what do you think about all that?
Well, I'm just imagining somebody in like a jail cell, and they're just like fucking staring at a concrete wall, and they've got blood tears coming out of their eyes, and they're going, wow, I'm so lucky to be here. Like, I am a miracle. I'm here.
Because I know you've been creating at some level based on our conversation. Tell us about your piece before we wrap up today.
Well, okay, so I kind of like the motifs that we're talking about with abstractions, right? And a lot of the themes that I feel like kind of escape us that are cyclical are about this idea of connectedness, everything being one. And I always had this idea where it's like, you know, it's up to your own perspective of if we're slaves to existence or if we are like blessed with it, right? So it's like back to the prison cell analogy. And so like for me, it's like I like to warp these images and like listen, feed off the conversations, because like I'll be thinking and chewing on these ideas, and then like a little movement of my brush will kind of like feed into these thoughts. You know what I'm saying? And so a lot of the times like there's no plan or anything like that. And it was awesome to kind of listen to your guys' conversation, because this thing just kind of evolved into the next step of being with thoughts that I already had going on in my own mind. So that's pretty neat. I would say that's pretty neat. That's Pat's 2 cents.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pat. And something that I definitely, as we wrap up, something I definitely should have said much earlier is that you look great. This woman, your Maggie Ledbetter, one of the most stylish ladies I ever met.
No, I mean, totally
love the fit.
disagree.
Love the fit.
I'm very basic. I just about.
Oh, shut up, Maggie. I've known you for 2 years. Basic is not a word to describe you.
I think, again, basic, it's literally semantic, because I do think I am. And I'm like, feel free to borrow.
You're wrong.
Because
that's
it's
my
like
semantic
jewel
reality.
Tones. No, it's basically like jewel tones, sequins, glitter, like form-fitting things. Feel free to steal it. I didn't invent any of them.
She says she's basic
together,
as she wears a denim romper with a dope-ass key over her breast and a green, like,
jewel tone green,
like tiger print, like cape.
Oh yeah, I forgot to
basic.
say animal prints. That's it. 6 things. It's pretty basic. I mean,
well then, Maggie, we have come to that part of the show. Plug your shit. Tell us about how people can get involved with you.
Oh, I mean, I own this place called the Underground Arthouse, and it's pretty underground, actually.
You would never guess, looking at the front of the house, what lies inside.
That's true. It's from the outside. It's very discreet. It's in a residential neighborhood, but it's basically like a clubhouse for artists and a stomping ground, but it's also more of a community. And our motto is "I just work here," which actually, incidentally, is Natural Philosophy 101. As a matter of fact, if we're all just here, then and then the question becomes, what work are we doing? What's your work? And also, that whole idea of like, what are we doing here? Right, and you get to decide. But also the kernel that represents the Underground Arthouse. She's sort of an everyman, Kernel. She's a rabbit. And designed actually by our friend Pat Merrick.
You deserve.
She's
Pat,
beautiful.
okay, Pat.
Yeah, Pat Merrick, a mutual friend of ours. I just think he deserves credit for because she's kind of an icon of underground hospitality, and that's what I want to be too. But very also underground, like a rabbit sort of. If you don't know, you better ask somebody. But Underground Arthouse on Instagram.
Check it out. They throw a couple events every year. If you get the chance to go to one, if you're in the Chicagoland area, don't be like Nils. Don't be stupid. Go to the event. He's a smart guy. He answered the call. some of the best experience you'll ever have. A
And you
lot
gotta
of
be
new
scrappy.
friendships.
You got to be scrappy. That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. Follow the rabbit, you know.
Follow
I can't
that
help you,
rabbit.
right? I'm not saying I don't know. I just work here. I'm just saying I don't know. I just
Well, follow the rabbit. And on that note, Maggie, Pat, thank you so much for your time. And that is a wrap for today. Episode 15. Woo! Hopefully I got the right.
yes.
Fantastic.
Feels the same when I'm the only person.
Oh, don't worry about it. Oh, don't worry about it. We taped it, so praise be to God.